the biggest class of people that are exploited that no one stands up for are in fact producers, are businessmen, are innovators, are people who create valuable products but are not recognized and fully protected for it.
All of them rely on productive companies like Google and Apple creating this environment, inventing their devices, creating their app stores, and everything that goes into it for Epic Games to be able to present their game to anyone and put it on some platform. Antitrust laws create opportunity for other producers and for the bureaucrats and government officials to go after the most productive companies and extract the benefits without paying rewards.
A tariff is a tax. It's a tax on imported goods. The importer, in this case a manufacturer, is being directly exploited by the government if it pays those taxes to the government. So that's a direct form of material exploitation. The alleged exploiters, the capitalists, are actually not only the ones being exploited, but they're being exploited because they're the benefactors, because they're the ones who bring value into the world. And so, yes, we need capitalism if we want to set people free from exploitation.
Does a company like Apple exploit workers, or is it in fact Apple that is exploited in our society? Do economic regulations and interventions make our society more just and fair, or do they enable exploitation of producers such as Apple? Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I'm Tristan Liege, visiting fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and with me are Robertas Bakula, associate, and Ben Bayer, fellow. Why does it seem as though so many aspects of our society are effectively at war with each other economically? Just consider the new tariffs, which are now effectively causing a trade war with Canada and China and other countries, on which so many people are divided and seek exemptions. Consider the constant struggles for power within antitrust, the constant lawsuits between companies competing against each other, for example, in the tech industry, and how companies have to watch their back as soon as they become too successful. Consider Google and Apple, just to name a couple examples. In this episode, we're going to discuss an important but underexamined aspect of the mixed economy, how it in fact enables exploitation. And I want to start by mentioning that there's a conventional sense of exploitation that you often hear in the culture. The idea that excessive profits on the part of businesses or employers or capitalists take advantage of workers and extract value that people didn't actually fully produce or didn't fully earn, and take it from workers and turn it into profits. Or the idea of price gouging is often given as an example of exploitation, when people take advantage of a temporary scarcity to raise prices. And I think it's worth starting by talking about how we're not using this sense of exploitation and what this sense of exploitation that I've just mentioned, the conventional one, what that depends on.
The standard view of exploitation relies on the Marxist view that it is labor, that mostly physical labor, it's the workers that create the value. And in Marxist view, or in the Marxist view, is that they get exploited by the capitalists, the owners of the capital, the owners of the factories, the owners of the land, who do not contribute productively to the outcome, to the creation of values, but only shuffle things around and somehow extract those values from the workers. And that view is the opposite of the truth. It's as wrong as you could get on the view, because the real producers of value, not to say that labor is not creating value, it's obviously an addition, but if you think about where all the values and all, especially the more advanced and more complex values in our technological society come from, they don't come from just movement of our bodies or physical labor. That comes from the mind, that comes from thinking, and that comes from primarily entrepreneurs and businessmen who conceive of those goals, who create a goal like, we need satellites up there orbiting the planet and giving us access to information across the world. And how do we do that? And they devised a plan. That plan gives rise to the need for labor in the first place, to all the workers and all the experts and specialized people who will contribute to the creation of the goal, and they in the path of pursuing those values. And if you have that view, and of course, the best place to go deep into reasoning why that view is true, why entrepreneurs and business and the thinking mind is the source of all values, is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand.
Yeah, Robertas, you mentioned that the Marxist view of exploitation is basically the opposite of the truth about the nature of exploitation. I think that's really important. You also mentioned Atlas Shrugged, where this is, I think, really dramatized. It's dramatized fictionally, and then there's commentary on it in a kind of nonfiction form in a major speech in the novel, where one of the major characters compares the relationship between capitalists and laborers to a kind of pyramid of ability. And it's the inverse view of the old Marxist view of the pyramid of exploitation, where the workers are at the bottom of the pyramid and they're holding up the world, and the capitalists just riding on their backs. In this view, in Rand's view, it's rather it's the capitalists, it's the creators of value who are in effect shouldering the world, carrying the laborers on their backs. And it's worth pointing out that even in an ideal system where everyone enters into exchange and employment contracts on a voluntary basis, and everyone's doing so freely, there's still an important sense in which the capitalist, the business person, is getting less than they give. They are, in a way, the greatest benefactors. The laborer could not have created the factory in which he is able to be productive and therefore earn a living. And we, as consumers, or laborers and consumers are sometimes the same person, but we couldn't develop the product that we are giving for money. So, like, I couldn't create an iPhone, and even if I had all the money in the world, I probably couldn't create it. So, to think about the fact that I get this iPhone for a few $100s every few months, I would pay much more for it if I could get that value. And if I had way more money than that, I still couldn't create such a value on my own. And so it's precisely the fact that business people create value through intellectual innovation, it's not just in the way that scientists or technologists do, but by putting supply and demand together, realizing there's a market for a scientific achievement. Bringing those two together, that's the integration that the entrepreneurs create and are great benefactors to the extent they are. And that's exactly what makes them targets for exploitation, the fact that they create this kind of value.
If you think about like the dictionary definition of exploitation, the idea of you're treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work, I think it's insightful and worth thinking about the specific ways in which in our society today, in the mixed economy here being the ways in which the government, on behalf of the public or for the sake of the public good, intervenes in and regulates economic activity. The ways in which that creates exploitation in this very sense, that of the dictionary definition of it, of unfairly benefiting and extracting value unfairly from the work of producers. We're mainly going to focus on ways in which that's done by force, by government force. And again, that's another major theme of Atlas Shrugged, is that it's, throughout history really, and certainly in our society today, that the biggest class of people that are exploited that no one stands up for are in fact producers, are businessmen, are innovators, are people who create valuable products, but are not recognized and fully protected for it. And I think it's objectivism's unique view of the nature of force, the nature of coercion, that makes it possible to see this clearly as coercion, in the sense that we're going to be talking about with these examples.
Yeah, just to add one thing about the unique objectivist view here, in the fullest context, fully considering all the factors at work, and especially if the form of exploitation is in the form of force, then there's a real and important sense in which that attempt will always fail. That is, you'll succeed in taking a value from another person, but there's a real sense in which you cannot yourself then gain that value. That, for one thing, especially if it's force. Part of what you're doing by taking something by force is you are working to destroy the person who is creating the value. You're in effect killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And that's because force, by its nature, is something that works to oppose the operations of the human intellect. And we've already talked about how, in this view, it's the mind that's the source of value. But if you're throttling someone's thinking, if you're locking them in a position where they're faced with various dilemmas, choosing between their life and their profit, then they can't think. It negates and it paralyzes their very means of survival, and in doing so, then you are cutting off the actual source of the value that you're depending on. Tristan, you mentioned that it's an unfair treatment of another person. I think the more it's certainly unjust, and part of what's unjust about it is that you are not treating human beings as human beings. You're treating them as, in effect, as animals, as beasts of burden. And this is a point that's really obvious if you're talking about the worst, most egregious forms of exploitation, like chattel slavery, where you literally push a person around, you put them in chains, you whip them, etc. But while that might be the paradigm case of it, it's not the only case. And the various kinds of edicts and controls and restrictions we're talking about today that also work through physical force are also examples of the same kind of thing, if perhaps not quite as obvious and is searing. But one way in which they definitely treat people as other than human beings is they assume falsely that, yeah, if we treat them this way, they'll just go on producing what they're already producing, which ignores the fact that no, the source of value is the cognitive work of the other person, work which requires reward, work which requires incentive, work which requires the ability to make choices, none of which is possible when they're working under force. And human beings are not just forces of nature that work unfailingly, like the sun will rise tomorrow. They require specific conditions, and you have to understand what those conditions are. You can't just treat them as animals or as weather patterns.
So I want to add one more thing before we move on to talking about antitrust, and this is that the term mixed economy. What do we mean by that?
Yeah, Tristan, mixed economy is a mixture between freedom and controls, a mixture between the free market and some kind of statist controls. And it's worth thinking about what the nature of that mixture is and what's significant about it, because you can contrast the mixed economy with both laissez-faire capitalism on the one hand, but also socialism, where government controls the entire economy. It owns and controls the means of production. A major lesson of the 20th century was that socialism cannot produce. And I think a lot of people now realize that. That doesn't mean, though, that they've suddenly become defenders of capitalism. Most of the time, what it means is they favor the mixed economy, which means they recognize that their life depends on the production of capitalists, but they want to, in effect, exploit those capitalists. They want that mixture. It's a mixture between letting the capitalists have just enough of a leash to continue to have some kind of incentive to produce, but then trying to channel that, trying to basically take the cream off the top and then use it for whichever public purposes they have in mind. That's the exploitation we're talking about.
Yeah. So with that in place, let's focus on antitrust and explore how the ways in which that enables exploitation.
Yeah, antitrust laws is a super stark example, as you will see, of this dynamic of exploitation. And it's a set of laws that is allegedly, the purpose of which allegedly is to govern, regulate competition in the market, because presumptively the market wouldn't govern the competition if it's left for free, wouldn't achieve the results that the antitrust enforcers or supporters want from it. So, like, let's say a monopoly or a big company would form, and we need to do something about it. That's the premise of antitrust laws. And what's important is, what does that create? What does existence of antitrust laws, which is in a sense a set of not even a dictates, but just granting arbitrary power to agencies like the Federal Trade Commission or Department of Justice to go in and decide and sue companies when they think they're either too big or too powerful, or have done something like raising prices or something else that the agents and the bureaucrats didn't really like. But not only government agencies can use that power of antitrust laws to go after companies, other companies can do that too. Some producers can go after others. And the example illustrating it today, very, very sort of brightly, is Epic Games, the company that creates mobile and computer games, suing two of its main partners, and partners is how I would call them, is Apple and Google. Suing them for what? So to access the players, to access the players and consumers, and to sell them the game like Fortnite. I guess it's the most popular game Epic Games as a company sells. I've never played it. They need to get on the device that those users use, either an iPhone or a Samsung or any Android phone where Google Play Store is installed. And to get there, they have to go through that app store, either Apple's or Google's. And Apple and Google charge a commission whenever you make a purchase of an app. So it's usually about 30%. If a user on an iPhone buys Fortnite, it has 30% of that price goes to Apple. And then any purchase within the game, whether it's whatever people buy in games, new content, skins, or whatever, every purchase there is also, there is a fee that has to go to the provider like Apple or Google. And Epic Games doesn't like that. It doesn't like paying Apple and Google. It's sharing its profit, it's sharing its revenue with Apple and Google, and it's saying that's unfair. Why are we sharing with these companies? And so they used antitrust laws to go after Apple and Google, trying to mandate them through the force of law to allow Epic Games to access their users on iPhones and Google platforms without paying that commission, access external payments without paying the commission or using the payment platforms of Google and Apple, and to avoid sharing that revenue, claiming that it's anti-competitive or that they're standing up for consumers or developers. And that's, of course, all nonsense, because what they're saying and using these laws for is, look, we want your platform. We need your platform. That's the only way we reach our users and gamers. And we need to use it. We have to use it, but we don't want to pay you. It's unfair that they have to go through your platforms to reach those devices. We want to be on a device, period. And the claim is, how ridiculous that claim is of monopolization. The Epic Games, of course, has to use the language that Apple and Google monopolized app distribution. Two companies monopolized monopolized the same thing. It's just, on the face of it, it's ridiculous. But that's what laws like antitrust, and then the bureaucrats who want to make a name for themselves, that they stand for a little guy, for a developer, that they are helping consumers to reduce prices, or whatever the goal, they want to create those reputations for themselves. And all of them rely on productive companies like Google and Apple creating this environment, inventing their devices, creating their app stores, and everything that goes into it for Epic Games is to be able to present their game to anyone and put it on some platform. For bureaucrats is to have a target. And that's, if anything is exploitation, then that's what's it. And that's just one example. There's multiple cases going on. I'll finish with just a few more very quickly. Now Google is being sued by the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. And while it's not other producer really going after Google, but it is ultimately someone will quote unquote benefit from that case, because one of the remedies proposed by the Department of Justice in the case is for Google to share the data that it built for 20 years of its research and managing its search engine with any other wannabe competitor. So, and still other case is Federal Trade Commission is going after Amazon and wants to prohibit Amazon to put on conditions on their sellers. So if somebody wants to sell at Amazon, they have to sign a contract, and Amazon says, don't offer lower prices on other platforms because you're benefiting from access to Amazon users, and we don't want you to just take those users and go to another place. So the lowest price you offer has to be on Amazon. And that's something that antitrust laws can prohibit Amazon to do too. And so all these users and of Amazon and consumers benefit from that platform, but now they want to have the benefit without rewarding the creator of the benefit. And that's what antitrust laws create. They create opportunity for other producers and for the bureaucrats and government officials to go after the most productive companies and extract the benefits, either in the name of somebody else or for themselves, without paying rewards and giving to the creators of those benefits.
Yeah, Robertas, I think it's worth pointing out that this point you make about the exploitative nature of antitrust is really important, because the way it's often framed is it's punitive. The companies have allegedly broken these laws against quote unquote monopolization. We could have a whole separate episode of what's ridiculous about thinking of that as a crime. And we could also talk about why, if it's to the extent that it's punitive, it's nihilistic, because it's aimed at destroying value for the sake of destroying value. But it's also worth pointing out that, whether that's the explicit justification of it or not, it so easily enables exploitation, and in a way, it's a rationalization for this exploitation of the kind that you talk about. And any time antitrust law is used to break up a company, which is one of the frequent ways it's used, you get the same result. You get a large company being broken up into a bunch of smaller fiefdoms, each of which has its own chief. And now you're basically giving new economic power. You're giving control over resources to somebody who, on a free market, would not have risen to that level, would not have actually earned it. You mentioned the DOJ wanting to take Chrome away from Google. I think that whoever ends up getting to run Chrome will be in that kind of position. Or take any of the historical cases, breaking up Standard Oil. J.D. Rockefeller had an enormous achievement and brought mass production of energy to the world, basically, brought them cheap and plentiful oil, which other companies had not been able to do at the scale that he'd achieved. And now that he's done that, it's split up into a dozen different oil companies around the United States, and they all get to have their time in the sun, pretending to be someone like J.D. Rockefeller, which of course they weren't.
I agree. Like, antitrust is one of the most, I think, straightforward examples of exploitation, and from our perspective, probably one of the worst, because it explicitly targets people who are, and firms and producers who are particularly successful. So I think that gives us a good starting point of an example of how the mixed economy enables exploitation. But let's turn to tariffs, which have been obviously all over the news the last 3 months or so. We're effectively in a heightened trade war, not just with China now, but with Europe and even Canada and Mexico. We have significant tariffs against them. So, in the broad sense that we're talking about here, we're just talking about tariffs as taxes on imports paid by importers. And for the sake of simplicity, I'd like to focus primarily on the tariffs that Trump reinstated on aluminum and steel to illustrate the example of how tariffs are exploitative. And so right now we have a 25% tariff on aluminum and a 25% tariff on steel, uh, unless it was melted and poured in the US. So any like steel that we want that is poured and melted, for example, in Canada, there's a lot of steel and aluminum that we get from Canada. Um, if you're buying it from them in order to, for example, build metal products, appliances, things like machine tools, like screw machine products, architectural products like fencing and railing, sheet metal, you're going to have to pay an extra 25% tax. And what's the point of this? Why do people support this? Well, the Trump administration and the uh, companies, the US companies in particular, companies like um, Nucor and Century Aluminum, who actually support these tariffs, they argue that this will bring back American manufacturing. It'll bring back US primary aluminum and steel production, which will create more jobs and create more domestic wealth. That's the rationale behind tariffs. And this form of, often people term it protectionism, this form of attempting to protect a domestic industry um, with tariffs. What's the actual consequence of that? Well, if you think about why were aluminum and steel plants in the United States, why were they failing? Why were people buying aluminum and steel from other places, such as Canada and Mexico and China? Well, it's ceteris paribus. It's because those other producers are more efficient. It's because those other producers are able to keep their costs down. Perhaps their labor costs are lower. Perhaps they have better energy sources, which is a huge part of the input cost, excuse me, of making steel and aluminum is the cost of your energy in heating and melting those materials, and the costs of mining. And if uh, firms in other countries were more efficient, more productive, more innovative in mining, in melting and pouring, and indeed in hiring more efficient labor that was more affordable, that means that by penalizing people from dealing with them, you're actually penalizing those firms and also the people who want to deal with them um, in choosing the more efficient producers. So that companies like Century Aluminum or US Steel or Steel Dynamics, the large aluminum and steel producers in the United States that support these tariffs, don't need to be as efficient as those foreign producers. It is force in the sense that um, what was previously a voluntary transaction, what was previously a transaction based on a rational calculus of cost and efficiency and who's the best and most innovative or most efficient person that I can trade with, which in this case might be a firm in Canada. Now I'm no longer allowed to trade with them as efficiently. Now an additional arbitrary additional cost has been imposed on us. And that means that I either have to deal with a less efficient producer or I have to lose money for no reason. And that is the point of tariffs, is effectively to prop up inefficient or uncompetitive domestic industries. And this will have a huge impact on different industries and producers that have to buy these metals. So I mentioned all of the different types of uses, and metal manufacturing, which is the umbrella term that covers a lot of the things that I said. So things like pipes, joints, machine tools, and so on. They will now have to deal with less efficient producers in the United States, or they will have to lose money for no reason. And the benefit of that market advantage, so to speak, of now having tariffs placed on their competitors, is in effect an exploitation of the people who now have to choose between purchasing things from less efficient domestic producers or paying more for the same goods than they would have normally had to pay.
Another, Tristan, another aspect of tariffs and how existence of them, which is part of the existence of a mixed economy, makes people who don't want to participate, who wouldn't otherwise ever think of being an exploiter or an exploited. Existence of tariffs makes this unavoidable. You're either exploited or the exploiter. And the good example of that is Wall Street Journal did a skit on YouTube about if you imagine the most American car, Ford F-150 pickup. That's an American car in my mind, at least. And it goes through some detail of how many thousands of parts and how complex of a supply chain it is to produce something like a car that nobody really thinks about what goes into it, right? We see them everywhere. And how much time do we spend thinking of how much time, effort, capital investment, thinking, and entrepreneurial creative thinking went into devising the supply chain and the process through which that car that we just go in a dealership and buy comes to them, and what goes into it, from the fact that tires come from South Korea and all the minimal parts multiple of which something like a gearbox consists come from different countries and different suppliers. And now that process was devised with reason, obviously, that business had purpose and plans and went through most likely painstaking negotiations and contracts to devise this whole process that leads to a car. And now they have to change that because the tariffs exist. And now, yes, somebody in US, maybe instead of Korean tires, somebody in US gets the benefit of producing tires for Ford.
It's worth bringing out just how many levels of exploitation there are involved in something like tariffs. And both of your comments have brought out several different dimensions of it. A tariff is a tax. It's a tax on imported goods. If you are, let's say, the Ford Motor Company, and you want to import all the different parts that you need to make that truck that you mentioned, Robertas, you're a producer, and you now need to pay a tax to the government in order to buy the parts that you want to use if you still decide to use them. So there you are, the importer, in this case a manufacturer, is being directly exploited by the government if it pays those taxes to the government. So that's a direct form of material exploitation. There's an indirect form of material exploitation that both of you have cited. So to the extent that the tariff disincentivizes importing from the desired producer, and if you instead then decide, well, I'll go with a cheaper domestic manufacturer, here now you have exploitation of that of the importer by the less efficient producer. The less efficient producer gets to have business they would not otherwise have had. But there's a third, and I think particularly profound form of exploitation involved here that's not material at all. It's a form of spiritual exploitation. And I think this really comes out, especially with tariffs. Why is it that anybody wants to reward that less efficient producer? Well, because the less efficient producer isn't content to just compete and lose in their competition and then, let's say, go out of business, go bankrupt and do something else, learn new skills, go into a better business. No, they want to give themselves the illusion that they're actually good at their job. They want to give themselves the illusion, oh yes, we're winning this competition. Never mind that it's because somebody has put a cudgel between us and our competitors. But no, actually now we're the ones who are on top. We're the ones who are running this industry. And they're still working. They're still running the industry. So they get this kind of pseudo self-esteem from, on the one hand, they're working, they're running an industry, they're not on the dole, but it's a fake form of winning. It's a fake form of work. They're getting the pseudo self-esteem of the cheater who looks like they win a competition. It helps them convince themselves that they've won a competition. And this is a form of spiritual exploitation. It's where the recipient, the beneficiary, the alleged beneficiary of the tariff, the less competitive industry, gets to pretend like they're actually good at something when they're not. And that's, I think, really, it's often what motivates these tariffs, because these groups push for this kind of favor from government. But it also illustrates, I think, what's really profoundly evil about them, for that the kind of dishonest mentality and pretense that it rewards.
Yeah, and in terms of the pseudo self-esteem, Ben, I think that's such an important point when you think about the motivations that people have for these tariffs, and when you explore like the goal of bringing back manufacturing, it's like, what is that goal, and like why do people want that? They don't want to have to deal with the economic realities of why that's not the case anymore. The fact that it's not efficient, it's not productive. I think part of the motivation is, well, so like we don't care about the fact that other firms, other countries have become more innovative in manufacturing, that they've outcompeted us. For example, in the case of Canadian steel manufacturing, we want to just be able to make it the way we used to, never have to change, never have to innovate. We want to be protected in that. And I think that is really exhibits kind of the mentality behind it, is that it's you want to benefit from the existence of this productive market without ever having to actually innovate or actually be fully productive in it. And so I think what you brought out about the spiritual element is really important. Um, and on the theme of supporting and protecting inefficiency, um, that's a good segue to agricultural subsidies, which are the next main form of exploitation that I want to focus on. There are a lot of different types of subsidies in our economy today. So by subsidies, I mean just government funding of industries or firms or individuals in order to encourage a certain type of behavior or protect them, a certain type of activity or trade from market prices, from the market realities of supply and demand. In slight contrast to the previous two examples, I think the clearest uh, person or entity who's exploited in the case of agricultural subsidies are actually taxpayers directly, in the sense that the subsidies that um, are funding farms that are subsidized and protecting them in all sorts of ways from the market, which I'll explain in a moment, um, are funded by taxpayer money. And that involves a number of important implications, not just the fact that taxpayers may not want to support those farms. And so they might be supporting farms or the production of food that they don't even consume, but that effectively shields farms from the need to actually stay innovative and to stay productive as they would in a free market. Um, I do want to add that part of the reason that this is relevant right now, or this is an ongoing thing, is because the Farm Bill is currently being debated in Congress right now. So, why does this exploit taxpayers? Well, what all of these subsidies in effect do is they reward and protect irrational behavior. So, for example, um, a lot of the price loss coverage and revenue shortage coverage elements of subsidies are based on crops that were produced historically in a certain area. So, for example, a farm that was producing corn like 5 years ago would count as a corn producer from the perspective of revenue shortage coverage, even if they're no longer producing corn. And that means that they will be protected and they will receive subsidies if there's a shortfall or a loss of revenue in corn, or a price change in corn, even if they're not selling it anymore on that piece of land, just because that's how it was historically used. It also rewards farmers for hiding crop losses or exaggerating crop losses, depending on the specific type of situation. So if they're getting ad hoc aid, or if they're getting revenue shortage coverage, farmers will be incentivized to exaggerate their losses in order to receive more subsidies. And certainly they're not going to be as motivated to innovate or protect themselves from losses if they know that um, agricultural subsidies will be able to account for that shortfall. And the general situation of this, and what's so egregious about it, is that instead of, as you would in a market, instead of having a situation where farmers continually innovate and are motivated to, for example, find ways to diversify crops, right? So that if they lose out on particular crops, they are less affected. That one thing that agricultural subsidies do is they incentivize monoculture. They incentivize um, build like creating a lot of the crop that you're receiving a subsidy for, rather than diversifying or producing crops that aren't subsidized. But that's irrational behavior. It's not behavior that you would do in a market that's in response to actual demand, actual supply, what people actually want, and what the real conditions are of farming, and the fact that you would have to continually innovate to stay competitive and maintain good revenue and be able to protect yourself from things like crop losses or competition from other farms. And because of this inefficiency being essentially protected, taxpayers are forced to fund and support farms that are engaged in all of these kinds of irrational behavior. And I think, um, given the theme of the fact that we're talking about the way in which it's producers in the mixed economy that are exploited, I think it's worth emphasizing here that taxpayers are not just consumers, right?
Yeah, the taxpayers who are paying for farm subsidies, they're paying for them through their income tax. Farm subsidies are paid for by general federal revenue, and that's generally funded by income tax. So it's not even, it's not like a sales tax is in question here. A sales tax is a tax on consumers, but in the United States, the federal government is funded through income taxes, and incomes are earned by productive people. Incomes are earned by people who take in more than they spend. And that's the primary way in which any of us who is a taxpayer, if we're paying income taxes, we're a producer, but we are then being forced to subsidize basically welfare to farmers, whether they're small farmers or big farmers. Conservatives traditionally used to be critical of so-called welfare queens, people who would live off the dole. But that's what both small and big farmers are doing, to the extent that they rely on these farm subsidies. And they're doing it off the back of all of the producers in the economy, to the extent that they're funded by the income tax. And in the name of what? Well, this goes back to something that came up when we were also discussing tariffs. Tristan, you pointed out that many of the less efficient industries who are trying to benefit from these tariffs, in effect, don't want to innovate. They don't want to do what's actually economically required for them to compete with their competitors by producing better products. They just want to be able to manufacture the same things that they produced for a very long time in the same way, in the same places, in the traditional form. And I think this comes out especially when we're talking about agriculture subsidies, because one of the justifications that's given for agricultural subsidies is they are there to protect and preserve, quote unquote, family farming. And the United States was built historically by farmers, by settlers. We can't give up that tradition. And even if it's true that disproportionate bulk of farm subsidies actually go to corporate farmers, it's still the family farm idea that's used as a rationalization for these. And that is what Ayn Rand called the divine right of stagnation, the idea that if you've reached a kind of level of comfort and stasis, you have a right to maintain that, even though what human life actually requires is growth and learning and moving forward innovatively and productively. The divine right of stagnation idea is I should be able to coast as a matter of metaphysical condition, and other people should have to support me in doing it, even if it means they are the productive people. They're the ones who are actually growing and producing and moving forward dynamically. I want to maintain my old stagnant way of life, and somebody else is going to have to foot the bill for it.
So let's kind of summarize here and think about some takeaways of what we've talked about. I think in each case, we've talked about how it's rational, productive individuals and firms that are being exploited as a direct result of the government intervening, of regulating economic activity, in the favor of, in the case of antitrust, in the favor of protecting alleged competition or fairness of market shares. In the case of tariffs, to protect domestic producers from foreign competition. And in the case of agricultural subsidies, to protect farmers from losses or risky behavior or changes in national prices of foods. And I think it's been implicit in what we've said, but I think it's worth emphasizing that there's a real injustice in all of these cases. All of these cases that we've looked at, all of these examples are lose-lose situations. Antitrust, it reduces, it creates an environment not just where Apple and Google are penalized, but anyone that wants to innovate in creating an amazing new platform, for example, that other firms or companies could use. They now have to think twice about investing in that. They now have to think twice about being too successful at creating a new technology or new platforms that might come across as uncompetitive. In the case of tariffs, there's an injustice of the people who work tirelessly and innovate in creating the incredible supply, like global supply chains, right, that enable us to afford the products that we afford. Like I recently read about how the iPhone, if you had to make it entirely in the United States, it would be something like $3,000. And it's like that's a clear example of the it's an injustice to the people who have figured out how to create incredible supply chains that have brought that price down, that they're now being arbitrarily penalized by these additional costs. And obviously, in the case of agricultural subsidies, it's a clear injustice to force taxpayers to fund wasteful and inefficient farming practices. And as you were saying, Ben, I think it's worth reemphasizing one last time that the benefits to the exploiters are illusory. You don't actually benefit from being protected in your non-ability to produce, your non-ability to compete, your non-ability to innovate. And same in the case of agricultural subsidies. Farmers don't get better at innovating. They don't get better at producing food just because they're shielded from risks, shielded from actual market realities. And so in the end, clearly, I mean, our view is the only way to eliminate exploitation of this kind, the only way to have a society where people deal with each other on the basis of trade, on the basis of respect, on the basis of who is the best and most efficient producer, winning and succeeding, and able to like move forward and be rewarded, is laissez-faire capitalism.
In connection with that, I want to bring things back to Atlas Shrugged, which we've mentioned a few times now. One of the reasons that I wanted to do this episode is because we'd done a previous episode on why capitalists don't exploit. It was a good idea to do one on why they are, in fact, exploited. And that should remind one who's, if anyone's read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, there's a chapter in that book called The Exploiters and the Exploited. It's very much aimed at this theme. It dramatizes what's wrong with the view that capitalists are exploiters, but also demonstrates how they are themselves exploited in a mixed economy turning into statism. And I'll just, without giving away any kind of plot spoilers, I'll mention a few highlights from that chapter that I think should intrigue someone enough to want to read this book, the kind of richness that this book exhibits. Just in the space of one chapter, in this chapter in part 1 called The Exploiters and the Exploited, we see at the beginning a contractor for a railroad, building a railroad, saying as his workers put the rails together how muscles are the source of all the value in the world. That muscles, unmediated by any mind, are what move the world. And this is, of course, a portrayal of that Marxist idea that Robertas was talking about before, the idea that makes capitalists look like the exploiters, because, of course, they're the ones who are employing the workers who seem to be doing all the work and then just profiting off of them. But we then, in that same chapter, later see how it's obviously not the case that it's just muscles that move the world. We see an innovator like Hank Rearden, the one who invents a new kind of metal, who shows up on the scene and explains to the vice president of the railroad how use of his metal is going to be able to make their job more efficient. A new method of construction is going to help them build a bridge across a valley that they need to complete the railroad. All of this being done with his mind, not his muscles. Even so, even as we see how his mind is the source of this value, we see various exploiters descend upon him. We see the State Science Institute that wants to buy his metal for illicit purposes using government money that they themselves taxed from him. We see the regulators working at the behest of the State Science Institute who want to say that his metal might not be as safe as he says it is, even as they value it. They're doing it in a move in order to gain leverage over their use of it. We see his worthless family who wants to mooch off of his wealth and then use it to spend on activism that threatens his own interests. And then, most importantly, at the end of the chapter, we see aforementioned equalization of opportunity bill passed, kind of antitrust measure that splits apart his business, tearing apart his life limb from limb, which he had vertically integrated to the purpose of creating this excellent metal and moving the world forward with it. So he is portrayed as the exploiter, but he is definitely actually the exploited in the context of this novel. And we talked earlier about why it's an inversion, of justice, why the alleged exploiters, the capitalists, are actually not only the ones being exploited, but they're being exploited because they're the benefactors, because they're the ones who bring value into the world. And so, yes, we need capitalism if we want to set people free from exploitation, but if we want to defend that system, we need to understand these kinds of rationalizations and inversions are at work. We need to undo these inversions, clarify these concepts, understand the real nature of what justice requires, and therefore do justice to the producers. And that is one of the things that Atlas Shrugged helps people to see, and one of the reasons we recommend reading it, of course.
I do want to recommend some resources that we can look at, or that you may want to look at, the listener, to learn more about our topic. We've mentioned Atlas Shrugged, obviously. There's also the collection of essays, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which we highly recommend. And then the episode that Ben had just mentioned, the Marxist exploitation myth, that Ben Bayer did with Nikos Sotirakopoulos. I think it was a couple of months ago on New Ideal as well. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and click the bell to get notifications for when we go live or post new recordings. If you are watching the recording, please like, comment on, or share the episode to attract new viewers. And consider doing the same if you're watching on Facebook. If you do have questions or comments about today's episode, or you have suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of your emails and reply to many. Thank you, guys.